Settle in and let the noise of the world drift far away. In this quiet retelling of Castaway, we follow a man whose life was once ruled by clocks, deadlines, and constant motion. But after a sudden plane crash leaves him stranded on a lonely island in the middle of the vast South Pacific, time itself begins to slow. With only the sound of ocean waves, rustling palms, and endless horizons for company, he must learn how to survive completely alone. Day by day, season by season, he faces the challenges of isolation, nature, and the silence that surrounds him. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift gently into this calm and reflective journey of survival, resilience, and hope beneath the endless ocean sky. Now, close your eyes and let the night carry you gently into dreams. Snow covered the streets of Russia as delivery trucks moved through the city under the pale morning sky. Workers hurried in and out of a busy shipping hub, carrying boxes from one place to another with careful precision. Inside the building, machines buzzed, scanners beeped, and clocks ticked endlessly on the walls. For most people, it was just another workday. But for Chuck Noland, every second mattered. Chuck worked as a systems analyst executive for FedEx. https://www.fedex.com. UTM_source=chatgip.com. And he took his job more seriously than almost anything else in his life. He believed that time was the most valuable thing a person could never get back. To him, every delayed package was a promise broken. As he walked through the Russian hub, workers straightened up the moment they saw him coming. Chuck moved quickly, carrying a clipboard and speaking with confidence. He pointed toward a conveyor belt that had slowed down. "We lose time there," he said firmly. "And if we lose time, we lose trust." The workers nodded and quickly got back to work. Chuck was famous within the company for traveling around the world and improving delivery systems. He could look at a shipment route and instantly tell where delays would happen. He could calculate wasted minutes like a mathematician solving a puzzle. To demonstrate a problem at the Russian hub, Chuck had sent a package to himself all the way from Memphis, Tennessee, to a small home in Nikolai, Russia. A young boy suddenly burst through the doors of the building carrying the package in his arms. He ran toward Chuck, slightly out of breath. "Package for you," the boy announced proudly. Chuck smiled and accepted it. The workers gathered around as Chuck carefully opened the box. Inside was a small clock. He held it up for everyone to see. When this clock started, Chuck explained, it was at 0. He checked the time displayed on it. 87 hours, 22 minutes, and 17 seconds. The room became quiet. Chuck shook his head. Too long. Some workers looked surprised. Others looked nervous. For customers, Chuck continued, time matters. Every package is important because every package belongs to someone waiting for it. The workers listened carefully as he explained ways to improve the process. Though he sounded strict, Chuck truly believed his work connected people across the world. Delivering packages was not just transportation to him. It was keeping promises. Later that evening, Chuck finally had a moment to himself. He stepped outside into the cold air and reached for the phone. Far away in Memphis, Tennessee, Kelly Frears answered. "Hello." Chuck instantly smiled at the sound of her voice. "Hey," he said warmly. "Guess where I am?" "Somewhere freezing?" Kelly guessed. Chuck laughed. "You know me too well." Kelly sat comfortably on her couch, smiling as they talked. Even though Chuck spent much of his life traveling, the two of them had managed to stay deeply connected. Their relationship had lasted through busy schedules, long flights, and constant distance. "When are you coming home?" Kelly asked. "In about 18 hours, Chuck replied. "I promise. You always say that. And this time I mean it." Kelly laughed softly. Chuck leaned against the wall outside the building, suddenly feeling less tired. Talking to Kelly always made him feel grounded. In a life controlled by schedules and deadlines, she was the one person who made him slow down. Back in Memphis, Christmas lights decorated homes across the neighborhood when Chuck finally returned home. The warm air felt completely different from the icy streets of Russia. At the airport, Kelly rushed toward him the moment she saw him. "You made it!" she exclaimed. Chuck dropped his bags and wrapped his arms around her tightly. For a brief moment, the world stopped moving. No planes, no schedules, no deadlines, only Kelly. The two spent the evening together laughing, talking, and enjoying the comfort of simply being near each other again. Their relationship felt easy and natural, as though they understood each other without needing words. Soon they arrived at the Nolan family Christmas dinner. The house was lively and noisy. Family members filled every room while music played softly in the background. Chuck's relatives greeted Kelly warmly because everyone already considered her part of the family. At dinner, Chuck's brother smiled mischievously. "So," he began, "when are you two finally getting married?" Kelly nearly choked on her drink while Chuck laughed nervously. "Easy there," Chuck replied. "We're just asking," his brother teased. Kelly and Chuck exchanged an awkward but amused look. Neither answered the question directly. Though they clearly loved each other, life always seemed too busy to stop and think about marriage. As dinner continued, Chuck suddenly winced while chewing his food. "You okay?" Kelly asked. "Toothache," Chuck admitted. "You need to see a dentist." Chuck shrugged. "I'll survive." Then his pager beeped. The sound immediately changed the mood. Kelly looked at him quietly. She already knew what it meant, work. Chuck checked the message and sighed. "There's a problem in Malaysia," he explained carefully. "It's Christmas," Kelly said softly. "I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Kelly understood Chuck better than anyone. She knew how committed he was to his job. She also knew he hated disappointing people. "When do you leave?" she finally asked. "Tonight." Kelly looked disappointed, but she hid it behind a small smile. "Just be back before New Year's Eve." Chuck nodded immediately. "I will." Later that night at the airport, the mood felt bittersweet. Travelers hurried around them while announcements echoed through the terminal. Kelly handed Chuck a small wrapped gift. "Merry Christmas," she said. Chuck opened it carefully. Inside was an old pocket watch. "It belonged to my grandfather," Kelly explained. "It's been in my family for years." Chuck looked touched. Inside the watch was a small picture of Kelly smiling brightly. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Then Chuck reached into his pocket and handed Kelly a tiny box. Kelly's eyes widened immediately. "Aren't you going to open it?" she asked hopefully. Chuck smiled mysteriously. "New Year's Eve," he said. We'll open it together when I get back. Kelly held the box tightly against her chest. I'll hold you to that. They kissed goodbye before Chuck headed toward his gate. As he walked away, Kelly watched him carefully until he disappeared into the crowd. Neither of them knew their lives were about to change forever. Hours later, Chuck boarded a cargo plane with 4 crew members. The aircraft carried countless FedEx packages stacked tightly inside the cabin. Rain pounded heavily against the windows as the plane crossed the Pacific Ocean. Chuck sat quietly while examining Kelly's watch. He smiled at her picture. Then the turbulence began. The aircraft shook violently. One of the pilots stepped out briefly, looking worried. We're losing communication, he shouted over the noise. The storm outside grew stronger. Lightning flashed across the sky. Suddenly, a loud explosion echoed through the plane. Everything lurched sideways. Packages flew through the air as alarms screamed throughout the cabin. Chuck grabbed onto his seat while the plane dropped sharply through the storm clouds. The pilots struggled desperately to regain control. Brace yourselves, someone yelled. The aircraft tilted again. Water sprayed through the cabin as the plane slammed into the ocean. Chuck was thrown underwater. Darkness surrounded him instantly. The freezing water rushed inside the wreckage while metal groaned and twisted around him. Chuck struggled to free himself, gasping for air as panic overwhelmed him. Then he spotted an emergency life raft. Fighting against the rushing water, he managed to grab it just before another violent wave swept through the cabin. The raft inflated suddenly and pulled him upward. Moments later, Chuck burst onto the surface of the stormy ocean. Rain crashed down around him as enormous waves tossed him through the darkness. The plane had disappeared beneath the sea. Chuck clung desperately to the raft while thunder roared overhead. Every wave threatened to pull him under again. He shouted for help, but the storm swallowed his voice completely. Alone in the endless ocean, Chuck fought to stay alive. And somewhere far away, Kelly waited for him to come home. The storm raged through the night. Huge waves lifted Chuck's small life raft high into the air before dropping it violently back into the dark ocean. Rain poured endlessly from the sky, soaking him completely. Every muscle in his body ached as he struggled to hold on. The wind screamed around him like a living thing. Chuck could barely breathe. One moment he saw nothing but darkness. The next, lightning flashed across the clouds, revealing mountains of water surrounding him on every side. He called for help again and again, but there was nobody to hear him. The cargo plane was gone. The crew members were gone. Only the storm remained. Chuck wrapped his arms tightly around the raft and closed his eyes, praying for daylight. Hours passed. At some point during the endless night, the waves slowly became calmer. The thunder drifted farther away, and the rain weakened into a soft drizzle. Exhausted beyond words, Chuck finally lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes again, sunlight warmed his face. For a moment, he did not understand where he was. Then the memories came flooding back. The plane crash, the ocean, the storm. Chuck sat up quickly. The raft had washed ashore on a small island. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze nearby while waves rolled peacefully onto the sand. Birds circled high overhead, and the sky looked impossibly blue after the terror of the night before. Chuck stumbled out of the raft and collapsed onto the beach. The sand beneath him felt warm and real. He was alive. Chuck lay there for several minutes, breathing heavily as he stared up at the sky. Eventually, he forced himself to stand. The island appeared completely empty. No buildings, no boats, no people, only trees, rocks, and endless ocean. Chuck checked his pockets and found Kelly's watch still attached to him. He opened it immediately. Her smiling picture stared back at him. Relief washed over him as he held it carefully against his chest. "You're still here," he whispered softly. Nearby, several FedEx packages had also washed onto shore. Some were damaged from the crash, but many remained sealed. Chuck gathered them together instinctively, almost as if he were still working. The sight felt strangely comforting. At least something from his old life had survived with him. He walked along the beach searching for signs of civilization, but there were none. The island stretched in every direction with nothing but ocean surrounding it. Chuck climbed onto a large rock and scanned the horizon carefully. No ships, no airplanes, nothing. Fear slowly settled into his stomach. He was completely alone. Trying to stay calm, Chuck drew a giant help sign in the sand using driftwood and rocks. He hoped that passing planes might spot it from above. After finishing the sign, he looked once more at Kelly's watch. The picture inside reminded him of home, of warmth, of safety, of everything he might have lost. As evening arrived, the island grew quieter. The sounds of birds faded while the ocean waves became louder in the darkness. Chuck sat alone on the beach hugging his knees. For the first time in his life, there were no schedules to follow. No meetings, no flights, no deadlines. Time suddenly felt meaningless, and that frightened him more than the storm had. Night came quickly. Without city lights or buildings nearby, the darkness felt enormous. Chuck listened nervously to strange sounds coming from the jungle behind him. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, animals moved somewhere unseen. Every noise made his heart race. Eventually, exhaustion forced him to sleep on the sand beside the raft. The next morning, Chuck woke up stiff and hungry. His throat felt painfully dry. He searched the island desperately for fresh water but found none at first. The tropical heat quickly drained his energy. Then he noticed coconuts hanging from nearby trees. Chuck grabbed several after many failed attempts and finally managed to break one open against a rock. Fresh coconut water spilled out. He drank greedily. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. After regaining some strength, Chuck explored farther inland. Dense trees covered much of the island, but eventually he discovered a small cave hidden between rocks. It was dark inside but dry. At least it could provide shelter. Chuck continued climbing higher until he reached the top of a rocky hill overlooking the ocean. From there, he could finally see the full island. It was small, far too small, and there were no nearby islands anywhere in sight. As he stood there hopelessly staring at the ocean, he suddenly noticed something floating near the shore below. Chuck hurried down the rocks as quickly as possible. His heart pounded with nervous hope. Maybe it was another survivor. Maybe someone else had made it. But when he reached the water, his hope disappeared instantly. It was the body of one of the pilots, the same pilot who had tried to help him during the crash. Chuck stood silently beside the body for several moments. The reality of the disaster finally became undeniable. Everyone else was gone. Only he had survived. With great effort, Chuck carried the pilot onto the beach. He dug a grave in the sand using pieces of driftwood and buried him carefully. "I'm sorry," Chuck whispered quietly. He stood there for a long time afterward, staring at the simple grave. The loneliness felt heavier now. That night inside the cave, Chuck opened Kelly's watch again. The tiny picture had become his most valuable possession. He traced her face gently with his finger. "I'll get home," he promised softly. "I will." But deep inside, doubt had already begun growing. Days passed slowly. Chuck searched constantly for ways to escape the island. He walked the beaches looking for anything useful from the crash. More packages occasionally washed ashore, along with broken debris from the plane. At night he watched the horizon carefully, hoping to spot ships. Then, on the third night, he finally did. Far away in the darkness, tiny lights moved across the ocean. A ship. Chuck jumped to his feet immediately. "Help!" he screamed. He waved his arms wildly and shined a small flashlight toward the distant vessel. But the ship remained far beyond hearing distance. Desperation filled him. Without thinking carefully, Chuck dragged the damaged raft back into the water. If he could just get closer, maybe the people aboard would see him. He paddled furiously toward the lights. At first it seemed possible. But soon the ocean currents became stronger. Massive waves slammed against the raft. The farther he moved from shore, the more dangerous the water became. Suddenly a powerful wave flipped him into sharp coral reefs beneath the surface. Chuck cried out in pain as his leg was badly cut open. The current dragged him violently underwater. Panicked, he fought desperately back toward the island. Bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, Chuck finally collapsed onto the shore once again. The ship disappeared into the distance. Gone. Chuck lay on the beach breathing heavily while rain began falling once more. Defeated, he slowly crawled into the cave for shelter. Inside, he discovered something unexpected. A tiny stream of fresh water trickled through the rocks. Chuck rushed toward it gratefully and drank deeply. The cool water gave him a small sense of hope again. At least he would not die of thirst. Exhaustion quickly overtook him afterward. The flashlight beside him flickered weakly before finally dying completely. For the first time in his life, Chuck found himself in total silence and darkness. No machines, no voices, no clocks, only the sound of dripping water and distant ocean waves. And somewhere beyond the endless sea, the world continued moving without him. Morning sunlight entered the cave as Chuck slowly opened his eyes. His entire body hurt. The cut on his leg burned painfully, and his hands were scratched from climbing over rocks and coral. Every movement reminded him that survival on the island would not be easy. For several moments, he simply sat quietly listening to the sound of the ocean outside. Then reality returned once again. No rescue ships had appeared. No airplanes circled overhead. Nobody was coming. Chuck stepped out of the cave and looked across the beach. More FedEx packages had washed ashore during the night. Some were ripped open from the crash, while others remained sealed and untouched. He stared at them thoughtfully. Inside those boxes could be anything. Maybe something useful. Maybe something that could help him survive. Chuck carried the packages one by one back to the cave. Years of working for FedEx had taught him to respect every package because each belonged to someone waiting for it somewhere in the world. Even now, stranded on an island, part of him hesitated before opening them. but survival mattered more. He picked up the first box carefully and tore it open using a sharp rock. Inside he found a fancy dress wrapped in plastic. Chuck stared at it blankly. Not exactly useful. He moved to the next package. Inside were videotapes. Another contained ice skates. Chuck frowned in confusion. "What am I supposed to do with these?" he muttered. Still, he kept everything. On an island, even strange objects could become important. One box contained a volleyball. Chuck tossed it aside without much thought and continued searching through the others. Then he found a package covered with a drawing of angel wings. The image immediately caught his attention. Something about it felt different. Chuck turned the package over in his hands carefully. Unlike the others, he decided not to open this one. Instead, he placed it safely in the corner of the cave. "Someday," he said quietly, "I'll deliver you." The unopened package became more than just a box. It became a reminder of his old life. A reminder that someday he would leave the island and return to civilization. That small hope kept him going. Over the next few days, Chuck began learning how difficult survival truly was. Food was a constant struggle. He tried eating coconuts, but cracking them open hurt his already injured hands. The tropical heat drained his energy quickly, and sleeping on the hard ground left him exhausted every morning. The biggest problem, however, was fire. Without fire, Chuck could not cook food properly or stay warm during storms. He had watched survival programs before and believed starting a fire would be simple. It was not. Hour after hour, he rubbed sticks together with growing frustration. Nothing happened. Smoke appeared briefly before disappearing again. His hands became raw and bloody. Again and again he tried. Again and again he failed. The island seemed to mock him with its silence. As the sun began setting, Chuck finally snapped. "Come on!" he shouted angrily. He threw the sticks across the cave. He kicked pieces of wood into the sand and screamed at the top of his lungs. Years of carefully controlled discipline exploded into pure frustration. He was hungry, alone, injured, and terrified. Breathing heavily, Chuck noticed something nearby. The volleyball he had tossed aside earlier now rested beside him. His bloody handprint stained part of its surface. Chuck stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly, almost without thinking, he picked it up. Using a piece of seaweed and blood from his injured hand, he drew eyes, a nose, and a mouth onto the volleyball. When he finished, the face stared back at him strangely. Chuck let out a tired laugh. "Well," he sighed, "hello." The cave remained silent. He stared at the volleyball for another moment before setting it upright nearby. "You got a name?" Chuck asked jokingly. Then he noticed the brand printed across the ball. "Wilson." Chuck nodded slowly. "Wilson it is." The volleyball, now transformed into Wilson, somehow made the cave feel less empty. Chuck sat beside it while trying once more to create fire. "You know," he muttered toward the ball, "this is harder than it looks." Of course, Wilson said nothing, but strangely, talking out loud helped. Chuck rubbed the sticks together faster and faster. Smoke appeared again. This time he did not stop. His muscles burned from exhaustion. Then suddenly, a spark. Tiny flames appeared in the dry grass. Chuck froze in disbelief. The fire grew larger. "It worked!" he shouted happily. Laughing wildly, Chuck jumped to his feet and danced around the flames like an excited child. After days of fear and failure, he had finally succeeded at something. The firelight flickered warmly across the cave walls while Chuck carefully cooked a crab over the flames later that night. He sat beside Wilson as if sharing dinner with an old friend. "You should have seen me out there," Chuck joked while eating. "I looked ridiculous." Wilson remained silent. Still, Chuck continued talking. The loneliness had become unbearable, and pretending Wilson was alive somehow eased the pain. Days slowly turned into weeks. Chuck adapted to island life little by little. The sharp blade from the ice skate helped him cut coconuts more easily. The dress fabric became fishing nets. Pieces of plastic from packages protected him from rain. Everything had a purpose now. Chuck's appearance also began changing. His clean business haircut disappeared beneath long messy hair. His beard grew thick across his face. His skin darkened from endless days under the sun. The organized businessman from Memphis slowly faded away. Survival changed people. One afternoon, Chuck suffered terrible pain from one of his teeth. The ache had been bothering him since before the plane crash, but now it became unbearable. He paced around the cave groaning in agony. "I can't take this anymore," he told Wilson desperately. Without a dentist or medicine, Chuck knew there was only one solution. He would have to remove the tooth himself. The thought terrified him. Using one of the ice skates and a heavy rock, Chuck prepared himself nervously. Sweat covered his face. "This is gonna hurt," he whispered. He pressed the skate blade against the tooth and struck it sharply with the rock. Pain exploded through his head instantly. Chuck screamed and collapsed backward. The cave spun around him. Then everything went black. Hours later, he regained consciousness lying on the ground beside the fire. The painful tooth was gone. Weak but relieved, Chuck laughed softly. "Well," he muttered toward Wilson, "that's one way to do it." Time lost meaning on the island. There were no calendars, no clocks, no meetings, only sunrises and sunsets. Eventually weeks became months. Then months became years. Chuck survived storms, hunger, injuries, and crushing loneliness. And through it all, Wilson remained beside him. The volleyball had become far more than an object. Wilson was his companion, his friend, the one thing keeping him connected to sanity. For long years passed on the island. For years of hoping. For years of surviving. For years of waiting for rescue that never came. The island no longer felt completely unfamiliar to Chuck. After 4 years, every rock, tree, and shoreline had become part of his daily life. He knew where to find fresh coconuts, where the fish gathered near the reefs, and which caves stayed dry during heavy rainstorms. The island had changed him, or perhaps it had revealed who he truly was when everything else had been stripped away. The clean-cut FedEx executive who once obsessed over schedules and deadlines was gone. In his place stood a thin, weathered man with long tangled hair and a thick beard. His clothes were patched together from scraps of fabric and old materials salvaged from the packages. Yet despite everything, Chuck was alive. Most people would not have survived a few weeks alone under such harsh conditions. Chuck had survived 4 years. One quiet morning, he sat outside the cave beside Wilson while staring out at the ocean. The volleyball rested across from him. Its painted face faded from years of sun, rain, and use. "Well," Chuck said thoughtfully. Another exciting day in paradise. A breeze moved through the trees. Chuck nodded toward Wilson. Yeah, I know. We could fish later. Talking to Wilson had become completely natural now. Chuck no longer realized how strange it might seem to anyone else. The ball had become his closest companion, the only thing standing between him and complete loneliness. Chuck picked up a sharp tool made from stone and scratched marks onto the cave wall. Each mark represented passing months. He had carefully kept track of time all these years. February, he said quietly. 2 more months. Wilson sat silently nearby. Chuck leaned back against the cave wall. The currents change in April, he explained, almost like he was speaking to another person. If we leave then, maybe we finally have a chance. For years, Chuck had tried to escape mentally by hoping rescue would come. But eventually he realized nobody was searching anymore. The world believed he was dead. If he wanted to leave the island, he would have to save himself. That idea terrified him. The ocean surrounding the island remained dangerous. The same powerful waves that destroyed the plains still crashed against the reefs every day. One failed attempt years earlier had nearly killed him. But Chuck could not stay forever. One afternoon, while resting near the beach, Chuck suddenly heard a loud crashing noise outside. He rushed toward the shore carefully. A large broken piece of plastic floated near the rocks, pushed in by the waves. Chuck grabbed it before the ocean could pull it away again. The object appeared to be part of a portable restroom door from some distant ship or wreckage. At first it seemed useless, but later, while staring at the plastic sheet beside the cave, an idea slowly formed in Chuck's mind. A sail. Excitement filled him for the first time in years. If I can build a raft strong enough, he whispered. He looked toward Wilson. We might actually get out of here. The possibility changed everything. Chuck immediately began preparing. Every day became focused on one goal: escape. He cut down trees using handmade tools and dragged heavy logs across the island. He tied the wood together with ropes made from tree bark and vines. The work was exhausting. His hands blistered and bled repeatedly. Still, he continued. He had spent years surviving. Now he was finally fighting to live again. When he ran out of natural rope, Chuck used cassette tape reels from one of the washed-up packages to hold parts of the raft together. Nothing was wasted on the island. Everything had value. As the raft slowly took shape, Chuck climbed to the highest point of the island searching for one final thing he needed: stronger rope. At the top of the cliff stood something painful from his past. A long rope still hung there from years earlier. Chuck stopped walking. The memory returned instantly. There had once been a time during his isolation when hopelessness became too heavy to carry. He had climbed this cliff believing there was no reason left to survive. But fear stopped him. Or perhaps hope had. Even after all the suffering, some part of him still wanted to keep going. Chuck stared quietly at the old rope for several moments. Then he slowly untied it. This time, the rope would help save his life instead of ending it. Back at the beach, Chuck carefully attached the large plastic sheet onto the raft to create a sail. The raft looked rough and fragile, but it floated. That was enough. As April approached, Chuck grew nervous. Every night he sat beside the fire talking to Wilson. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked one evening. Wilson remained silent as always. Chuck sighed deeply. "Yeah," he admitted. Staying here won't work either. The island had become both his prison and his home. Leaving it meant risking death in the open ocean. But remaining meant slowly losing himself forever. Finally, the day arrived. The sea currents had shifted just as Chuck predicted. The weather looked calm. It was time. Chuck stood on the beach beside the finished raft while staring at the island one last time. For years earlier, he had arrived there terrified and helpless. Now he was leaving stronger than he had ever imagined possible. Before boarding the raft, Chuck walked to a large rock near the cave and wrote a message upon it. A sign that someone had lived there. A sign that someone had survived. Then he picked up the unopened package with angel wings and carefully secured it among his supplies. Throughout every hardship, he had protected that package. It represented hope, purpose, a future beyond the island. Chuck climbed onto the raft beside Wilson. "You ready?" he asked. The ocean waves crashed loudly ahead of them. Chuck swallowed nervously. Then he pushed the raft into the water. The first waves slammed hard against the wooden frame. Chuck struggled desperately to guide the raft through dangerous coral reefs while giant waves crashed around him. Several times the raft nearly flipped over, but Chuck kept fighting. Stronger waves came. He rowed harder. The island slowly drifted farther behind him. For hours he battled the ocean currents until finally, the raft broke free from the reefs. The violent crashing waves disappeared. Suddenly the water became calmer. Chuck looked back toward the island. It had grown small in the distance. A mixture of fear and relief filled his chest. After 4 years trapped there, he had finally escaped. The endless Pacific Ocean stretched before him now. Danger still surrounded him. But for the first time in years, Chuck was moving forward. The island disappeared slowly behind Chuck as the raft drifted farther into the Pacific Ocean. For a long time, he continued staring back at it. That tiny island had stolen 4 years of his life. It had brought him pain, loneliness, and fear. Yet somehow it had also kept him alive. Now it was becoming smaller and smaller until finally it vanished beyond the horizon. Chuck turned toward the endless ocean ahead. Nothing surrounded him except water and sky. The realization was both beautiful and terrifying. "Well, Wilson," Chuck said quietly, "there's no turning back now." The volleyball sat tied securely to the raft beside him. The sail caught the wind gently, pushing them farther across the sea. At first, the journey almost felt peaceful. The ocean moved calmly beneath the raft while sunlight reflected brightly across the waves. Birds occasionally circled overhead, and cool breezes replaced the heavy heat of the island. For the first time in years, Chuck allowed himself to imagine returning home. He pictured Memphis, Kelly, warm beds, real food, conversations with other people. The thought felt almost unreal now, like memories from another lifetime. As days passed, survival on the raft became a new challenge. Chuck collected rainwater using pieces of plastic stretched across the raft. When storms passed through, he carefully stored every drop inside containers salvaged from the island. Food was harder. Using handmade fishing tools, Chuck managed to catch small fish from the ocean. Sometimes he ate them raw. Other times he managed to cook them briefly over tiny fires when conditions allowed. It was not much, but it kept him alive. At night, Chuck lay beneath the stars listening to the ocean. Without city lights, the night sky looked endless. Thousands upon thousands of stars stretched across the darkness. "You ever think about how small we are?" Chuck asked Wilson one evening. The waves gently rocked the raft. "Back home, everything felt important," Chuck continued. "Meetings, flights, deadlines." He looked upward thoughtfully. "Out here, none of that matters." The ocean had changed his understanding of life. Time no longer controlled him. Survival did. Hope did. Human connection did. Several peaceful days passed before trouble returned. Dark clouds gathered suddenly one evening. The wind strengthened. Chuck looked nervously toward the horizon. A storm was coming, fast. He quickly secured supplies to the raft while waves began growing larger around them. "Hang on, Wilson," Chuck warned. Rain slammed into the raft moments later. Thunder cracked overhead while giant waves tossed the small raft violently across the ocean. Chuck clung tightly to the ropes as freezing water crashed over him again and again. The sail whipped dangerously in the wind. The raft groaned under the pressure. Hours passed in chaos. Chuck could barely see through the rain. Every wave threatened to destroy the raft completely. Then a massive wave struck harder than all the others. The raft flipped violently sideways. Chuck screamed as he was thrown into the freezing ocean. For several terrifying seconds, he struggled underwater in complete darkness. He reached desperately for the raft and finally managed to pull himself back aboard. Breathing heavily, Chuck checked his supplies. Much of the raft had been damaged. Then his face suddenly filled with panic. "Wilson!" The volleyball was gone. Chuck spun around frantically searching the stormy water. "Wilson!" Another wave crashed over him. Then, through the darkness, he spotted the volleyball floating farther away. Relief flooded him instantly. "There you are." Without thinking, Chuck jumped into the ocean after it. The freezing water pulled hard against him as he swam desperately toward Wilson. One hand reached for the drifting volleyball while the other held onto a rope tied to the raft. The current fought against him. The raft drifted farther away. Chuck stretched his arm as far as possible. Almost there. Almost. The rope slipped from his grasp. Panic exploded through him. He grabbed the rope again quickly, but those few seconds were enough. Wilson had drifted farther away. "No!" Chuck shouted desperately. He swam harder. The volleyball bobbed helplessly through the waves. "Wilson, I'm sorry." Tears mixed with rain across Chuck's face. For 4 years, Wilson had been his companion, his only friend, the one thing that kept him sane during endless isolation. And now he was losing him. Chuck reached again. Too far. Another wave separated them. "Wilson!" The volleyball drifted farther into the darkness. Chuck's strength faded rapidly. Finally, exhausted and defeated, he stopped swimming. Wilson continued floating away across the endless ocean. "I'm sorry," Chuck cried weakly. "I'm sorry, Wilson." The storm swallowed the volleyball completely. Gone. Chuck slowly pulled himself back onto the damaged raft. For a long time, he simply lay there crying. To anyone else, Wilson was only a volleyball. But to Chuck, losing Wilson felt like losing a real friend. The loneliness returned stronger than ever. The storm eventually passed by morning. The ocean became calm again, but the raft was badly damaged. Chuck himself was weak, cold, and exhausted. Days passed afterward in silence. Chuck barely moved. Without Wilson beside him, the raft felt emptier than the island ever had. His body grew weaker from hunger and dehydration. The sun burned his skin while endless waves rocked the broken raft gently through the open sea. At times, Chuck wondered if this was the end. Maybe he had survived the island only to die in the ocean. One afternoon, while lying motionless on the raft, Chuck heard a strange sound nearby. A burst of water sprayed high into the air. Chuck slowly opened his eyes. A massive whale surfaced beside the raft before disappearing beneath the ocean once more. For a brief moment, Chuck simply stared in amazement. Even after everything he had endured, the world still held beauty. Then another sound reached him, a distant horn. Chuck forced himself upright weakly. Far away across the water, a giant cargo ship moved toward the horizon. At first Chuck thought he was imagining it, but the ship remained there, real. Hope surged through him. Chuck grabbed a piece of fabric and waved it desperately. "Help!" he shouted with all the strength he had left. The ship continued moving. Closer now. Chuck screamed again. Finally, the enormous cargo ship began turning toward the raft. They had seen him. Relief flooded through Chuck so suddenly that he nearly collapsed. After years of isolation, after storms, hunger, and heartbreak, rescue had finally come. Chuck stared at the approaching ship while tears filled his eyes. He had survived. The massive cargo ship towered above Chuck's damaged raft. Crew members leaned over the railings, shouting instructions to one another while lowering rescue equipment into the water. Chuck could barely keep his eyes open. His body was weak from dehydration, hunger, and exhaustion. Sunburn covered his skin, and every muscle ached painfully after days drifting through the Pacific Ocean. Still, he forced himself to stay awake. After everything he had survived, he refused to lose consciousness now. A rescue worker finally reached him and carefully helped him onto the ship. "You're safe now," the man assured him kindly. Safe. The word barely felt real. Chuck collapsed onto the deck while blankets were wrapped around him. Crew members gave him water carefully as doctors checked his condition. Voices surrounded him. Human voices. For the first time in years, Chuck was no longer alone. The realization overwhelmed him. As the ship continued across the ocean, Chuck rested inside a small medical room, recovering slowly. Sometimes he stared silently out the window at the sea. Other times he simply sat quietly, struggling to understand that his nightmare was finally over. For entire years had passed since the plane crash. The world he remembered no longer existed. One morning, a crew member entered the room carrying fresh clothes. "We'll reach civilization soon," he explained with a smile. Chuck nodded quietly. Civilization. The word felt strange now. He barely remembered how normal life worked anymore. Several weeks later, Chuck boarded an airplane heading back to the United States. Unlike the cargo plane years earlier, this aircraft felt calm and peaceful. Still, every sound made Chuck nervous. Whenever turbulence shook the cabin slightly, his hands tightened instinctively against the seat. The memories remained close beneath the surface. As the plane flew across the clouds, Chuck stared out the window silently. He imagined Kelly waiting for him. He imagined walking through the airport and seeing her smile again. That thought had kept him alive through countless hopeless nights on the island. Now he was finally going home. When the airplane landed, reporters and cameras crowded near the airport. News of Chuck's survival had spread quickly across the country. People believed he had died years ago. Now he had somehow returned. Chuck stepped slowly through the airport surrounded by company officials and reporters asking endless questions. How did you survive? What was it like on the island? Did you ever lose hope? The noise overwhelmed him. After years of silence, the modern world felt unbearably loud. Flashing cameras hurt his eyes. Too many voices. Too many people. Chuck barely answered any questions. Then he noticed a familiar face approaching him. His old friend Stan. Stan smiled emotionally before hugging him tightly. "You're really here," Stan said softly. Chuck smiled faintly. "I made it." Stan looked amazed as he studied Chuck's appearance. The years on the island had changed him completely. "We all thought." Stan paused carefully. "We thought you were gone." Chuck nodded slowly. "I know." As they walked together, Stan explained what had happened after the crash. Search teams had looked for survivors for weeks but found nothing. Eventually, everyone believed the plane had been completely lost at sea. A funeral had even been held for Chuck. Hearing those words felt surreal. The world had mourned him while he fought every day to survive. Then Stan's expression became more hesitant. "There's something else," he said gently. Chuck immediately sensed the change in his voice. "What is it?" Before Stan could answer, another man approached them. Chuck did not recognize him at first. The man looked nervous. "Chuck," he said carefully. "My name is Jerry Lovett." Chuck frowned slightly. Jerry glanced downward awkwardly before continuing. "I'm Kelly's husband." The words struck Chuck like a physical blow. For several seconds, he could not speak. His mind struggled to process what he had heard. Husband. Kelly was married. Jerry looked uncomfortable. "She wanted to come herself," he explained softly. "But it's all very emotional." Chuck stared silently ahead. For years earlier, Kelly had been waiting for him to return home. But 4 years was a lifetime. People moved on. Life continued. Even when he had been trapped on the island, the world kept turning without him. That night, Chuck attended a gathering with friends, family, and co-workers celebrating his return. Everyone smiled warmly and welcomed him home. But despite the laughter around him, Chuck felt strangely distant, like a visitor observing someone else's life. Modern conveniences amazed him now. Ice cubes in glasses, electric lights, soft carpets. Simple things most people never noticed suddenly felt extraordinary. At dinner, Chuck stared quietly at a seafood dish placed nearby. The sight reminded him instantly of the crabs he once cooked over fires on the island. Later, he picked up a cigarette lighter from the table and clicked it on. The small flame flickered gently. Fire. Once, creating fire had meant survival. Now people barely thought about it. The island had changed how he saw everything. That evening, Chuck returned alone to the large house prepared for him. The bed looked soft and comfortable, but when he tried lying in it, he felt trapped. Uncomfortable. After years sleeping on the ground inside caves, normal life no longer felt natural. Eventually, Chuck climbed out of bed and lay down on the floor instead. He opened Kelly's watch once more. Her picture remained inside exactly as before. For years, that watch had kept him alive emotionally. Whenever loneliness became unbearable, he looked at her picture and remembered why he needed to survive. Now everything had changed. Still, Chuck knew he needed to see her. Not for anger, not for blame, for closure. The next evening, Chuck drove quietly through familiar Memphis streets until he finally arrived outside Kelly's home. His heart pounded nervously. Lights glowed warmly inside the house while rain fell softly outside. Chuck stood at the front door uncertainly. Before he could knock, the door suddenly opened. Kelly stood there staring at him. For a moment, neither moved. Neither spoke. Then Kelly rushed forward and wrapped her arms tightly around him. Chuck held her close while emotions overwhelmed them both. "You're alive," Kelly whispered tearfully. They stepped inside quietly. Kelly looked older now, more mature, but her eyes remained exactly the same. Chuck reached into his pocket and carefully removed the watch. "I kept it safe," he said softly. Kelly stared at the watch in disbelief. "You still have it. It helped me survive." She held the watch gently, tears filling her eyes. For several moments, neither knew what to say. So much time had passed. Too much. Kelly eventually showed Chuck something else she had kept through all the years. His old car. "I couldn't get rid of it," she admitted quietly. Chuck smiled faintly while taking the keys from her hand. The silence between them carried years of unfinished emotions. Finally, they kissed. For one brief moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But reality returned quickly afterward. Kelly pulled away sadly. "I have a family now," she whispered. Chuck nodded painfully. "I know." Later, as Chuck drove away through the rain, Kelly suddenly ran outside after him. "Chuck!" He stopped the car immediately and stepped out. Kelly ran into his arms once more. "I always loved you," she cried. "I never stopped." Chuck held her tightly. "I love you too." The truth made everything harder. They loved each other deeply, but time had moved forward without permission from either of them. Finally, they understood there was no way back to the life they once imagined together. Slowly, painfully, they let each other go. Rain continued falling softly as Chuck stood beside Kelly's car. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement while neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence between them carried years of love, grief, hope, and loss. Chuck looked into Kelly's eyes and saw the same sadness he felt inside himself. For years earlier, they had planned a future together. Now that future belonged to the past. Kelly wiped tears from her face. "When they told me the plane was gone," she whispered, "I didn't believe it at first." Chuck listened quietly. "I waited and waited," she continued. "Every time the phone rang, I thought maybe it was you." Her voice trembled. "But after a while, everyone said you were gone." Chuck lowered his eyes. On the island, he had imagined returning home to exactly the same life he left behind. That dream had helped him survive endless loneliness and suffering. But dreams could not stop time. Kelly stepped closer. "I tried to hold on," she admitted softly. "I really did." Chuck nodded slowly. "I know." The rain soaked through their clothes, but neither cared. For a brief moment, Chuck wished the world would simply stop moving again. Just long enough for them to stay together. But life did not work that way. Finally, Kelly touched his face gently. "You have to keep living," she said. Chuck looked at her carefully. Those words stayed with him. Keep living, not surviving. Living. There was a difference. Chuck kissed her one final time before stepping back. "Goodbye, Kelly." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Goodbye, Chuck." Slowly, Chuck climbed back into his car and drove away into the rainy night. Kelly stood there watching until the headlights disappeared. Neither of them knew if they would ever see each other again. The following days felt strange for Chuck. The world moved too fast. Everywhere he looked, people rushed from place to place, staring at watches, answering phones, and worrying about schedules. Before the plane crash, Chuck had lived exactly the same way. Now it all seemed meaningless. One afternoon, he sat alone in a hotel room staring at a table covered with unopened mail and company papers. FedEx executives wanted interviews. Television networks wanted his story. People wanted explanations. But Chuck struggled to explain something even he barely understood. How could anyone truly describe 4 years alone on an island? How could he explain talking to a volleyball because silence became too painful? How could he explain the strange feeling of missing a place that nearly destroyed him? The island had changed him forever. Chuck walked to the window and looked outside at the busy city below. Cars moved endlessly through the streets. People hurried along sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Everyone seemed trapped by time. Suddenly, Chuck remembered something he once said to workers in Russia years earlier. "We live or die by the clock." Back then, he believed it completely. Now he knew life was far more fragile than schedules and deadlines. Everything could disappear in a single moment. Plane crash, a storm, a wave. Time itself meant nothing if you forgot to truly live. Days later, Chuck finally decided to leave Memphis for a while. He packed quietly and loaded several repaired FedEx packages into his car. During his years on the island, he had opened most of the packages searching for tools and supplies. But one package remained untouched. The package with angel wings. The same package he protected through storms, hunger, and despair. For years it had given him purpose. Now he intended to finish the delivery. Chuck drove for hours through long empty roads stretching across the countryside. Unlike before, he no longer hurried. He stopped when he wanted. He rested when he felt tired. For the first time in his adult life, he was not racing against a clock. Eventually, he arrived at a quiet rural home surrounded by open land. The house looked peaceful and isolated. Chuck stepped out of the car holding the unopened package carefully. The angel wings remained painted across the box exactly as before. He walked slowly toward the front porch and knocked on the door. No answer. Chuck waited a moment before knocking again. Still nothing. He looked around quietly. The house appeared empty. After a moment, Chuck placed the package carefully beside the front door. Then he pulled out a small note. On it he wrote, "This package saved my life. Thank you, Chuck Noland." Chuck left the note attached to the box before returning to his car. As he drove away, he felt strangely emotional. The package had carried him through the darkest years of his life. Delivering it felt like closing one chapter of his journey. Later that afternoon, Chuck stopped at a crossroads in the middle of open countryside. For different roads stretched in separate directions. Unsure where to go next, he unfolded a map across the hood of his car. For several minutes, he simply stood there studying the roads. His future suddenly felt wide open. No island trapping him. No schedules controlling him. Just possibilities. A pickup truck approached nearby and stopped briefly. A woman stepped out and smiled politely. "Need some help?" she asked kindly. Chuck looked up. She explained where each road led. "One goes north toward Amarillo," she said, pointing. "Another heads south to Lubbock." Chuck listened carefully. Then he noticed something painted on the back of her truck. Angel wings. The exact same wings from the package. Chuck stared in surprise. The woman smiled warmly, unaware of the meaning behind his expression. "Thanks," Chuck said softly. She nodded before climbing back into her truck. As she drove away, Chuck continued watching thoughtfully. The unopened package had belonged to her all along. The same package that had inspired him to survive. The same package that reminded him there was still purpose waiting somewhere beyond the island. Chuck smiled faintly. Life remained uncertain. Painful memories would always stay with him. He had lost years he could never recover. He had lost Kelly. He had lost the person he used to be. But standing there at the crossroads, Chuck finally understood something important. His life was not over. For years, he had been trapped between past and survival. Now, for the first time since the plane crash, the future stretched ahead of him once again. And somewhere beyond those roads, a new beginning waited.